everybody. Here we are at LearnBiz, and we're going to talk about something. So this is going to be a little bit more of a free flow episode because I've got something that I've been working with recently, and I kind of want to get your take on it and sort of throw a few things out there. So basically, when you're a small business, a lot of small businesses, in fact, the vast majority of small businesses do better when they are selling at high margin.
Yes.
It's really hard for a small business to come in as a low-cost leader, and it usually chews them up, spits them out, and just runs them over. So if you're a small business, unless you have a legit competitive advantage, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, what I mean by legit competitive advantage, but unless you have a legit competitive advantage, you need to be on the high margin. Well, here's the problem. Everyone understands that conceptually, but then you get down to the specifics of what is the high margin. Because you've always got this, everyone's like, I'm not gonna do a price race to the bottom. There's all these expressions that we get into, and they're very anecdotal. Now, we're all about the numbers. I huge fan of using your financials to make the decisions. But the problem comes in when you need to shift in your business, because when you're running smooth, you want to stick with a certain level of margin. Now, I'm going to talk about two things that happened recently. One is very broad, macro, and the other is more specific to something that I'm working on.
So as you're thinking about that, though, before you finish your thought, when you talk about high margins, most people are going to think, all right, I'm in a niche type business versus a commodities. And you can probably, commodities tend to make that worse. However, I hope that we have the conversation that you can be potentially in a commodity market and still have high margins.
Okay, so yes, and we'll get to that. Let me give these two scenarios, and then we'll start diving in. Okay.
Right.
So scenario one is global inflation just hit hard for everybody. And I actually just read an article yesterday, I think it was a CNN article, that it talked about retailers. Major retailers are now having to really slash prices. And they cited some examples, like IKEA was a big one that they cited in the report. They talked about Walmart in the report. And they talked about these big retailers that when inflation started hitting, they were jacking up their prices 10, 20%. And now all of a sudden consumers, this report was specific to the U.S., but I think it would translate to similar markets like the European market and other things like that. But other global markets I can't speak to. But here in the U.S., consumers are starting to run out of consumerism. They don't have the spending that they had. And so they're cutting back on these quote-unquote luxury items, and they're really looking at the nuts and bolts. And so these retailers that are selling stuff that's not, it's not a need, it's a want, they're having to slash these prices to try and lure consumer spending again, because whether you like it or don't like it, and I'm not a fan of this, but the U.S. Economy is driven by consumerism. We've set it up to where we're a bunch of consumers. And the political government, especially at the federal level, if ever they start to see economic problems, they pump money to consumers to get more spending to happen and kind of keep that wheel moving. I don't think that's a very healthy, sustainable model. I think that's going to come back to bite us, and I think maybe we're seeing some initial signs of that. But so you get into this situation where you've got hyperinflation that's coming up, and now you've got kind of this yo-yo effect happening with major retailers, and you've got small businesses who they sort of have to decide, okay, what do I do? Do I raise my prices because their costs have gone up, right?
That's right.
So I don't know any business that hasn't had significant increases in their cost. If you're a producer or manufacturer, your inputs went up. If you are purchasing, it's a retail model. Then all of the things that you're purchasing, those costs have gone up.
Yeah.
If your service, I've seen that the labor costs have really shot up.
Oh, yes.
And so your costs have gone up, and then I see these small businesses, they have to make the decision, do I increase my costs so that I keep that margin where it's historically been, or do I try and absorb some of this cost so that I can stay competitive with this changing landscape, right? And so that's the first example I'm going to give of a shift in business. If business is just going, if inflation is just coming at 2% and you're just kind of gradually adjusting things, that's
Right,
one thing.
right.
But when costs are going 10, 20% up, some people are absorbing it. Some people are kicking back really hard. It's shifting the markets.
Right.
So what do you do with your margins? Okay, so that's point number one. And then point number two is, so I just got back from doing the Intermat World of Concrete show in Paris. Had a booth there. It was kind of an exciting opportunity doing that international show. And so I'm working on some of these international deals. Now, to try and sell internationally, you have to fight shipping and tariffs and all of these things that really cut into the profit. Well, I'm not the one selling direct in Europe. I'm selling to distributors who are then selling out. So
Right.
everyone's going to take their cut. So they expect me to come down in margin to a point that it makes sense. And I don't feel like anyone's beating me up on price, but the harsh reality is I've got to come down. They've got to come down because, this person takes their
Right.
cut, this person takes their cut, this person takes their
Right.
cut. And all of a sudden, to do an international expansion, you've given up margin. And so again, if you're a small business and it's like, oh, you got to have the margin, but there's no way you're going to go international and expect to have those same margins. So that's point number two. So with that, quite a long intro. I apologize. So let's get into a little bit, and I've kind of ranted, so I'm going to let you take over. Maybe let's start with just this whole idea of why small businesses need the high margin, but I ultimately want to get to how far down can you go before it's a bad deal, before it doesn't make sense.
Well, the simple answer for margin is it's just easier when you're not competing in a commodity market.
Okay.
Because commodities is all about price. So if I can't raise price because I'm in a commodity, then I have to cut my expenses, right?
Mm-hmm.
To make more profit. So if I'm in a highly competitive industry, it really is challenging because you have to survive off innovation, right? You have to have changes and improvements constantly, and there's always a cost for that R&D type stuff. So if I can get into a market where I'm not driven by price per se, so I can actually find ways to make larger margins. One is if I'm a average business owner, it just gives me more room to make mistakes because you're going to make mistakes, right? And the better the margins I have, the more I can weather those mistakes. Because in a commodity industry, you make a mistake and it can easily put you out of business because you just have no wiggle room.
I've seen businesses selling large volume at a loss because they contracted themselves into that situation.
Yeah.
They're like, well, I wanted this was a good customer. They do a ton of volume with me. Yeah. And so I was doing all this negotiating. I negotiated poorly, and now I'm losing money. And so, when you're talking about the mistakes, but I want to add something. There's not only mistakes, but there's also the cost of the calculation. So if I have to have a finance team that, first off, they're trained to, when you look at some of those major retailers, they have an entire department that is just calculating, okay, if we go half a penny off here, what does that do for the entire business?
That's right.
They're trained in that. They have advanced degrees, so they're not cheap employees, and they're working full time for you. A lot of small businesses just don't have that manpower, and they can't afford that manpower to look at, oh, hey, if we shave here, it offsets it.
But I'm going to be highly critical right now.
Okay. That's what makes it interesting.
And that's why it's important as a small business owner that you have allocated time to work on financials, right? Because you have to have the times that hey, I'm crunching numbers, I'm looking at this, I'm running scenarios. Because most small business owners don't do that because finances are there, but it's not a priority.
Yeah.
They don't have dedicated time. This is this part of my day or this day of the week. That's what I work on. I work on my financials, my projections. I look at different scenarios. I'm running those opportunity costs to do that. So that's so highly critical. If you're a small business owner, if you're not setting aside time to do this one, just turn off the podcast because we can't help you.
Well, and I want to get a little bit more critical and not just look at the time, but I want to look at the habits. How many small business owners are like, I've been doing this for 20 years. I know.
Yeah.
And I'm like, in 20 years, you're telling me that nothing has shifted?
It has changed?
That you don't need to recalibrate? I mean, honestly, how often do you take your car in to get in alignment? I don't care how new that car is, how finely tuned that car is. Just the miles on that car is going to take it slightly out of alignment. So you take it in and get it realigned. And so maybe it's not just a question of time. It's also, swallow some of your pride, have some humility, go back to the basics. I've never seen a professional who is amazing at anything that doesn't go back to the basics. You look at a musician, they're still playing their scales.
Yeah, that's right. So, all right. So putting that aside now that we've slaughtered a few people, but when you start looking at margins, okay, you're really looking at two components of your margin, right? What am I selling it for and what are my costs, right? The only way to get higher margins is to sell it for more or to cut costs. That's the only two ways you can do it. And you and I both, I would think, would argue that when you're cutting costs, you have less room to cut costs than you do when it comes to increasing sales.
If you're well managed, you've already managed those costs to a pretty low point.
Right.
It's hard to keep managing those
Sometimes
down.
you can get some margins and a few other things, but
I do love the expression, you can't cut your way to growth.
Yeah.
And there is some of that where it's like, you got to trim the fat, but at some point you're going to start trimming muscle.
Yeah. So it's important. You have to know what your costs are. And, it's interesting that, and I'm going to simplify it down. We just recently did a junior entrepreneur thing. And because I bribed you to come in and help judge, but
we even did the full episode on this.
But it's really interesting that as I sit back at that point in time and I listen to the judges and you say, all right, tell me about your costs. Even junior entrepreneurs who are dealing with really simple numbers and a product that's not that complex to do, there's a percentage of them that still cannot come down to what their actual costs are, right? That number still feels so vague to them, or they're not sure how to get it. And even though with mentors and a little bit of help to try to guide them, they do it. So I'm a believer that for most businesses, they really don't understand their costs.
Yeah.
They don't.
Yeah, I would agree.
And so you've got to come to grips with that. And if you have multiple products in a production line or whatever it is, that cost then becomes that much more complex.
But okay, so here's, and I'm a little hesitant because I feel like I'm shifting gears and I don't want to shift gears. So I want to bring this back to costs. But one of the concerns that I see is that you've got businesses that they don't understand their costs, but they understand where they are. And they're used to where they are. They're used to seeing how much cash they have in the bank to make payroll. They're used to knowing what it costs to bring in a shipment of inventory. They're used to whatever their insurance costs are, their rent costs are, right? They're kind of used to seeing some things, and they just get kind of accustomed to this. And I think that's good, but it's not best, because you do need to calculate those costs and have those, those really clear understandings. But the issue that I see is you get someone who's used to a cost, and then all of a sudden that cost change, hyperinflation hits.
Right.
And the question becomes, should we or can we absorb this inflation? Should we? So, that CNN report that talked about how retailers, they kind of gouged. Honestly, I don't think it was the most ethical thing where...
Well, but it's... I'm going to use gasoline as an example. Okay. So tanker truck pulls up and I pay... I'm going to keep numbers simple. I pay $1 a gallon, my cost to do it, right? So I add on my 20% and I charge $1.20 for a gallon of gas. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, here's the thing. Something happens in the market tomorrow, and that gas prices are going to go up, right? So I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm going to charge $1.30 because my competitor who bought his gas tomorrow had to pay $1.10, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And his price went up, so I'm going to move my price up, right? Even though my inventory, I only paid $1.04, so I'm making better margins, right? Well, there comes a point in time now where I have to buy that new gas, but that's not uncommon, that scenario in most industries that produce anything, that I buy inventory at one price, something changes in the market, but because I have old inventory or I purchased inventory at a cheaper price, I can charge more for it, and I start gouging. But the problem is when that adjustment has to be made, right? Because I have to buy the new inventory at a higher price, and now that higher price, I might be charging $130, but now I buy at $120, and now all of a sudden my margins got really tight. Mm-hmm. I'm in trouble, right? Because if my competitors still bought it there and they're holding out, and I start trying to go higher, this is why it's really hard to compete in a commodity industry, because it's all about a low price, cutting costs is where you save money doing it. So it becomes extremely a very strategic tactical game on how you play it. So being in an industry and trying to figure out how do I diversify enough, or how do I find a uniqueness in my product so that I'm not competing on price per se, but now I'm competing on other factors so that I can keep my margins different. So when things change, I have latitude to make some shifts in our business model, and then make the appropriate adjustments so that I'm staying highly competitive. I can do it.
So, okay, but I'm going to argue, you said that businesses don't know their cost. I'm going to add to that, businesses don't know their elasticity. Because that's what you're talking about here.
That's exactly
you're
right.
talking about price elasticity.
That's right.
And I mean, when I say that, everyone's like, yeah, cost. Okay, cost. Elasticity, what's that? And so not only do they don't even know what it is per se, and it's so hard to calculate, to the point that oftentimes you can't calculate it. If you don't have enough data points, and if you don't understand, I mean, this is high-level economics that you're getting into when you're looking at price elasticity, because depending on how elastic my product or service is, going with your example of the gasoline, well, at some point, I have to get to work. I have to take the kids to school. I have to put gas in my car. But, in the CNN article where it talked about IKEA, and it talked about like a headboard and a bedroom set. And it's like, do I have to have that? No. And if you think about it, even when you start getting into, these luxury items, where do you go first? Like if you're selling a house, it's the kitchen, it's the entryway, it's the front yard, and so the same kind of thing is like my bedroom. I can put up with an outdated, crappy bedroom and make the rest of my house. So that they have to adjust to consumer spending, whereas gasoline or a gallon of milk or some of these and commodities tend to get that way, where it's like, okay, there's the commodity price, but I'm sort of stuck paying that commodity price because I need commodities. That's sort of the give and take behind the commodity, is that, well, it's a need item and that's what makes it a commodity. There's no luxury markup that the business can put onto it.
Yeah. Well, and I, the whole time I'm thinking, if you're running a small business and you're paying attention to any little bit of tidbits out there, whether it's CNN, a number of banks put out economic reports. There's a number of financial like investment companies that put out financial projections that do all that. I mean, that information is out there. It's not that hard to find. But, the one I watched just the other day was that we're in a pattern that's following, was it the 2008, 2009 recession?
Okay.
Right in there. We're following that exact pattern to a T when it came to COVID, how things with inflation and everything, and then how it's shifting and now inflation's starting to come back. To where now that potentially could ripple to the same thing that we felt back then. And they were trying to say, yeah, but we don't think it's going to happen because of this or this or this. But my first thought was, oh, but it will. Patterns are very powerful when it comes to economics. So I'm like, okay, as a business owner, I'm going to be playing my cards really smart because those patterns are there. So as a business owner, if I'm watching some of that stuff, you know what I mean? And I'm starting to talk about price and cost and other things, I'm not overly stressed because at least there's indicators out there. They're just saying this potentially is coming. I can be making adjustments now because it's painful to make adjustments that are retroactive, because of not retroactive, reactive because of something that just took place.
Well, so an interesting thing that I just read about was that the gap between the CEO and their earnings versus labor is the biggest gap that we've had since just before the Great Depression. So the 1920s had a similar gap. So you're talking about patterns, and I'm like, oh, and so, you look at, there's a lot of warning signs, a lot of scary warning signs, which again is a good argument. Well, okay, I'm going to contradict myself here for a second, because on the one hand, it's a good argument to state you want to have those higher margins for the extra room of error. So if something does happen, you then have some cushion, some flexibility. But looking at the international piece that I'm doing right now and saying, okay, diversification might be also what you want to go after when you've got uncertainty in markets, and now you're selling into other markets. So if one market fails, you've got another market to go with, but that one requires tighter margins. Because you're not going to, like you can't get into that on the same margins just because of shipping tariffs, duties, all of those things.
Well, and then another point to bring up is that if you're studying what's going on in the industry or similar industries, and you understand what the top competitors' margins are compared to yours, at least you have a reference to say, hey, look, if I'm higher than that, I'm probably doing okay. It's out there.
It's out there for some industries. There are some industries that, man, you want data, you've got data. And by the way, you need to know as a small business owner how readily available information is for your industry. You need to know if it's easily available or if it's difficult to come by. And if you can't answer that question right now, that's where I would start. Is I would say, okay, find out how readily available this information is.
And don't be afraid to pay a little bit. I tell most business owners, don't be afraid to pay for data. Mm-hmm. It might cost you a couple $100, but it can open up a better perspective on really what's going on in your industry, trends that are coming out, glitches that might be in the process. You know what I mean? It was crazy during COVID that, and I don't know why I was tracking it, but watching lumber prices.
Oh, because they were interesting.
Yeah. So I kind of got fascinated with watching what was going on in the lumber prices and stuff. And it was really cool because one of the reports that I watched said, hey, you know what, because of this, and this, lumber prices you'll see will start coming down, right? And you always go, in some way you always kind of go, yeah, we'll see, right?
Yeah.
But it was dead on, right? It did. It exactly what happened. It came back down. The board foot price was down, and so in that industry, in that report, I thought, okay, they know what they're talking about and what they're doing, but that's only because you're watching it frequently enough that you can understand that, yeah, they know what they're talking about.
And I think I want to take a second here and I want to talk about watching data, reading reports, following trends, because already I can hear someone on the other end of this being like, look, I barely have time to listen to your podcast, and now you want me to go follow lumber trends? So this is how I'm going to sum it up. Yes, you need to be doing this. And the top businesses are doing this.
That's right.
And it's the same thing if I want to be a professional athlete and no one wants to take time to stretch, to do all of the strengthening exercises, but the second that they have a torn meniscus, now they have time to do all this rehab because they got to get back in the game. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, it's just what you have to carve out time.
And I think it's, my advice is always, look, find the 2 or 3 critical points. Meaning if I have anything that is tied to shipping at any level, I want to watch what's going on with fuel prices, right? That's one indicator, because if it's going to go up or down or whatever else, I know that it's going to change my costs to just, get stuff out to my wholesalers, distributors, etc.
Yeah. What are the root causes?
Right.
Do you need to know what, a barrel price is going for?
That's right.
You need to know what, raw materials are going for.
If I'm selling coffee, right, I want to watch what's going on with coffee beans, but I also want to watch what's going on in those countries when it comes to weather, economics, right? I want to track some of that, because that is going to affect politics. Yeah. It's going to affect the price of that raw bean getting to me in order for me to produce some type of a coffee for my consumer.
But the flip side, and this is where I also want to go, is to say, yes, you need to be doing this, but don't beat yourself up if you're not like living and breathing this. No. Just schedule a block of time.
But with today's technology, though, here's the beauty of it. With today's technology, I can have alerts just sent right to me, right?
That's true.
I can have it tracking stuff all the time and just have little news things that come across. And when I see one that interests me or go, ooh, I better read that one, I can click on it and read it. Otherwise, they just kind of come and go, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm in injection molding, okay, I want to know what's going on with plastics.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is there changes? Are there new developments? And there's places out there that are always releasing information that I can just have these news feeds coming across. Mm-hmm. And then when I see the 1 or 2 that I go, okay, that one could hurt me or be a huge benefit, I just read more about it. Hey, yeah, they're now found a new product that can do the XYZ.
Be careful. So this is super frustrating, and I'm on a tangent here. I'm on such a tangent. So your news feed is fed by an algorithm, and the algorithm, it's self-feeding. I wish that there was a way to get past well, there are. There are some better sources that are more objective, and they don't trigger only the articles that are based, like if you look at your YouTube feed right now.
Hey, this is a good point. I'm glad you're bringing this up.
When you look at your YouTube feed and it's like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. Well, that's because you got on conspiracy theory crap for the last week.
And then that's all it's going to send you.
Yeah, and now you're getting prepper kits sent to you in the mail. Like it's what happens. Right. And so when you're looking for sources, you need to look for credible sources. One of the best things that I've ever done, I learned more about the U.S. political spectrum by going outside of the U.S.
Yes.
And looking at news sources that aren't based in the U.S. Because they're not trying to push as much of an agenda
or manipulate you
as the right and left are here in the States. And so when I step outside of the U.S. and get some news, I'm like, oh, that's what actually is really going on. And then I can balance it better with some.
Just a great point.
So yeah, when you're looking for stuff, the other thing that I would say is the more boring the data is, the more reliable it tends to be. Like if you're just looking, if someone's just showing you graphs and numbers, because it's not sensational. And so like the sensational news, be careful that you're gearing your decisions based on sensational news. You really want to be looking more at reports, especially any report that's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Looking at stuff as simple as the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones and just seeing how they're moving and how they're tracking, the unemployment rate, those kinds of things that are a little bit pulled out of an agenda, and it's just data. It's like, here's the calculation that we're doing, and you can see the calculation. Like that, you don't have to only do that, but make sure that's mixed into how you're reviewing your information. What are we talking about anymore?
Well, the idea was margins.
Margins. I know.
But this goes. That question is pretty profound because of the fact that when you want to talk about margins, we're not talking just about what are my costs and what can I charge for it. So I know we want to make it that simple, but in order to really make those for long-term sustainability and growth, we have these other factors that have to be part of those two pieces. Otherwise, we find ourselves not making good decisions.
So can I talk about something here for a second? And I'm going to go to the micro level. So we've been at this macro. I mean, we probably maybe went out too big macro. I'm going to bring it into the micro level. As a small business owner, you need to understand the key differences, and I want to emphasize key differences between your gross margin and your profit margin. You need to understand what happens when you have a cost of goods versus an operational expense, because margin is not just margin. And when people say, oh, hey, I want to operate on the margins, which margin are we talking about? And how are you doing? Because cost of goods, you have a lot less control over your costs of goods versus operational. That's where you have tons of management control. And, if you don't understand, so cost of goods sold, I want to emphasize that means you sell goods. And so if I'm a service-based company and I only sell services, I don't even have that gross margin. And so I'm strictly looking at the profit margin, which most of the time, if I'm service-based, I don't have to play the margin game as tight as if I'm product-based. If I'm product-based, the margins matter a lot more, which means the gross margin matters a lot more. And so understanding the difference between a gross margin and a profit margin and how those move, super critical.
Right. Yeah, I can't say it any better.
Well, thank you. So I guess that goes back to, I want to wrap up by asking you the same question that I started with. When there's a major shift whatever that major shift is. I'm expanding into new markets. I'm introducing a new product mix. I got hit by hyperinflation. Whatever that major shift is, how do I know if I'm okay to sacrifice those margins?
My answer is always going to be, as a business owner, how much are you willing to take as a pay cut?
You think that's it? Because at some point you might be willing to do some austerity, but is it going to come back to kill your business or paint you into a corner?
It could, but if I can hold my production line, my supply line, if I can keep those whole, and I can weather the storm, i.e., through absorbing a less that I take home in my pay as a business owner, because generally they're the ones who are taking the most pay home, and by most reports, significantly more than the lay person inside the organization. I can usually survive that. But if all of a sudden you say to me, well, I'm not willing to take a pay cut, I'll just cut someone else out of the whole dilemma of it. The problem is that piece always has a reciprocating, it just ripples everywhere and affects something else. Something else is going to be affected.
So I agree 100% with what you said. I think great advice. I'm going to answer my own question with a little bit of a different take. And I think you have to have both, right? But I'm going to say, do you have a clear vision in your company? And if you have vision and this supports the vision, then go ahead. If you don't have clear vision, you better get clear vision before you start making dramatic changes. And if you have clear vision and this doesn't support, then you know that's not the direction to go. But a lot of times I'll see businesses that they don't have clear vision. They're just looking for opportunity, and they're like, oh, hey, cool, look at this opportunity. I'm like, that's great. Seize opportunity. And it's hard to envision all opportunities, so sometimes things just pop up. But if I'm over here taking an opportunity, and I'm over here taking an opportunity, and I'm up here taking an opportunity, all of a sudden I'm no longer taking an opportunity. I just have no discipline. And that to me is where it gets risky, because I can cut the margin if I know what I'm after and I know that that's going to get me there.
Yeah, that's right.
That would be my answer.
Okay.
So, all right. Well, I think we'll wrap up with that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode, and if you guys like going in depth on some of these things, let us know if there are other topics you want to cover. But we appreciate you joining us. If you want to learn more about your finances, check us out. All of our learning content is on jazzjune.com/learnbiz, and you can check out those things. And then you can also see some of the upcoming opportunities where we're going to be presenting. We got some cool virtual trainings coming up. If you're interested in those, check those out on jazzjune.com/learnbiz as well. And with that, we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, everyone.